Later science from Mike and the compelling reasons for us to care from Margot. So in some ways, perhaps I have the easier job today to talk about the things that we can do in response to the challenges that we've heard about and which can help us to create hope in the present. Because the good news is that there is much that we can do in our churches, our communities, and as individuals, and there is much great work going on already. Having grown up with a passion for nature and a developing Christian faith, nonetheless, as a student in the early 90s, I heard very little about the environment from a Christian perspective, perhaps for some of the reasons that Margot so helpfully explained earlier. The emphasis was more on social justice. And I think across society too, the environment and those sounding alarm bells about it were very much on the fringes. I was quite a perhaps geeky teenager standing in a panda suit outside Sainsbury's raising money for WWF way back in the 80s when it was a much smaller organisation than it has become. Today, though, the challenges that we all face couldn't be clearer. As Mike says, the science is now unequivocal. And almost every time I turn on the radio, I hear something about the environment, perhaps because I'm a Radio 4 listener. But it is so much more in our consciousness. And David Attenborough too, and many others like him, Greta Thunberg, have done so much to bring this to the fore at a time which couldn't be more critical. So where is the church at on climate change today? Well, 25 plus years on from my university days, all the historic denominations and many new streams of church are engaging in climate change. Around the country, local churches with their communities are taking action in unprecedented numbers. As Mike just said, we're over 5,000 registered eco-churches, and every diocese in England and Wales has registered for an equivalent scheme. The same with the URC and the Methodists, also taking lots of action. And in 2020, the Church of England committed to reaching net zero by 2030. Again, I'm so grateful that Mike has explained that term. And there'll soon be a route map as to how we're going to try to get there. And they're setting a lead with many other denominations now following. And around the country, many different organisations, local councils, businesses are establishing plans for carbon reduction. And last year, when COP27 was held in Glasgow, more than 2,200 churches of all denominations across the country took part in a Climate Sunday campaign in the run-up to COP26. So these examples are evidence of a fundamental change in the awareness, attitude, and action by churches, as well as many other sectors of society, on climate change. And we should be encouraged that big change can happen. So what can we do to bring about even deeper and faster change in church and in society in the critical years ahead? Well, there are 50,000 churches in the UK in every village, town, city, and neighbourhood. Imagine the impact if even a quarter of these, with their communities, and many other organisations I include in that, to care for the earth as fully as we are able. Or if even a quarter of us started speaking up through campaigns to urge the government and businesses to go much faster towards renewable energy and regenerating the UK's carbon sinks based on some of the nature-based solutions like restoring our peatlands, wildflower meadows, and so on. So what can we do to make this go even faster and deeper? Well, just very briefly about Arosha UK, the organisation that I work for. I've been there for 4.5 years. Our mission is to equip Christians and churches and their communities to protect and restore the natural environment. And we do that through work on eco-church, with our partners in action, with our wild Christian community of families and individuals, and through our convening work, such as our involvement with Climate Sunday last year. And I'll touch on each of these as we go through. But of course, churches don't exist in isolation, and so many of these actions are in conjunction with the wider community. Let me begin, though, by framing our actions in terms of some day-to-day practices that we can cultivate. In their book, The Future We Choose, Christina Figueres, former exec secretary of the UN Convention on Climate Change up to about 2016, and who led the Paris Agreement work, and Tom Rivett-Carnac, who worked with her, write that our current crisis requires a total shift in our thinking. To survive and thrive, we must understand ourselves to be connected to all of nature, and we need to cultivate a deep and abiding sense of stewardship. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, or Praise Be, in 2015, expressed it like this, that we all need an ecological conversion of our hearts and minds. Because there is in each of us, I think, an inherent love of nature, which is often more evident in young children and which we can lose in the busyness of our lives as adults. During the pandemic, though, it's as though many of us rediscovered the nature on our doorsteps, neighbourhoods filled with birdsong, clearer rivers and waterways, space to be, and around the world, animals emerging from the narrow spaces to which they'd been confined. I remember watching a programme about those South African penguins and how it was so much easier for them to get from the seashore to their nesting sites without having to manoeuvre through all the bodies of sunbathers lying on the beaches. What we love, we're far more likely to take care of and have an active relationship with. So you may not have expected me to start here in terms of actions and how we can respond, but spending time in and developing a love for the natural world, whether it's trees, insects, or puffins, a particular favourite of mine and on the red list, will help us to transform ourselves and also sustain us. So can we start by finding joy in every day with gratitude for what we have? And a way to share and develop this with others can have any number of outlets, from walks to photography exhibitions, creative ways of engaging people, growing and sharing food, and so on. Well, let me come to EcoChurch, which started in 2016 as an award scheme to help churches to take action to care for the earth across every aspect of church life. And as we've heard, it's grown to a community of many different churches, all at different stages of action, but learning together and increasingly supporting each other, and many working in partnerships with schools, councils, businesses, and other charitable organisations. I will say more about the mechanics and getting started with EcoChurch in the workshops this afternoon, but in brief, it covers 5 key areas of church life, from worship and teaching, which is foundational, to the management of our buildings and land, if we have these assets, to community engagement at a local and global level, and finally, though by no means least, our lifestyles. We can start with small steps, though. Perhaps this is the bit about the light bulbs. But many of these actions I am going to frame from an EcoChurch perspective, but they're actions that we can also take in our homes, gardens, workplaces, and elsewhere. And if you're here today as a non-church goer, someone from a different faith, whatever your context, then I really hope that you can sort of approach this with some curiosity and see some opportunities of ways that we can partner together even more deeply. Let's start with the small things that we already do, though. As Christians, we may have established prayer time. We do have established prayer times, hopefully, in our churches and our individual lives. And we can start by giving thanks for this wonderful world and then praying for its restoration. And if prayer is not a familiar practice, gratitude is an often mentioned practice of meditation, stress reduction, helping us to improve our well-being. I do just want to pause for a minute and refer to an area of pastoral care and perhaps fear and grief. Because as we hear those statistics that Mike shared with us this morning, we may feel a deep sense of grief when we think about our broken relationship with nature and the ways this is seen in our world today. And we may feel grief about what we have already lost and what we stand to lose in the future. And much of this is already baked in. So as we think of species that face extinction in the next decades and the people being displaced by climate change, And it's clear that there are far-reaching mental health impacts from climate change, with phrases like climate grief and eco-anxiety becoming commonplace, and especially amongst the young. So we therefore need to be more equipped in our churches and in our communities to acknowledge and face this sense of loss and grief around the environmental crisis together. And it's one of the things that I think we can develop to do in our churches, to offer support and safe places for churches, for people from the community to come and discuss the future that we want and demand accountability from our institutions and governments on their response to the environmental crisis. If you want more insight into that in particular, then do look at the Climate Sunday website, and we can send some links after today, where you'll find a recording of a webinar on that topic last year with Reverend Lucy Winkett from St James Piccadilly and other people, notable people. Moving on to our buildings in a different way, they are the places where we welcome each other and where we can take many simple steps, like switching to reusable cups, as part of our hospitality, to little actions like changing our light bulbs, also to changing our energy provider, which St Lawrence's has done here. I know we're in the middle of an energy and cost of living crises, but we have to move off fossil fuels much faster than is currently being planned. And for any church or for any of us as individuals, switching to renewable energy can be an easy, quick win. And many churches and communities are generating their own energy from solar panels and other renewable technologies, the costs of which have all come down radically in recent years. And they're now able to save money from that in the long run. And by the way, it's possible to do that even in a listed building. We've got quite a few growing number of examples of churches that are listed that have been able to go down the renewable generation track. Though that's perhaps not the first place to start. There are the everyday things like insulation, looking at the windows and so on, and ensuring that our buildings serve us in the way that we need them to. Coming onto land, we've set a goal that at least 75,000 acres of land owned by churches and Christian organisations and individuals will be managed for nature in the next 5 years. Managed in a way that some of the natural solutions can take effect. We're not, as a Roche UK, and have no intention of becoming a large landowner, though. We've got one council-owned site in Southall in West London, which I'm going to show to you in a minute, that we manage, and a piece of land on the borders of Essex that was gifted to us. But the rest of our work is through Partners in Action, Christian landowners across the country, like Adventure Plus in Oxford, that you may have heard of, right up to Abernethy Trust in Scotland. But of course, churches have land too, and there are often so many areas of land in our communities that are neglected, maybe alleyways, grass verges, and council-owned where they may not be proactively managed, that can present opportunities for us to adopt a piece of land and to care for it. Land where we can plant trees. Mike was just telling me about how he's been offering trees to any number of estates and organisations around Hungerford. And here are just a few of the ideas of ways that we can manage our land better. Native wildflowers, there's a workshop on that this afternoon. Not using pesticides, trying to plant for pollinators so that we can help the bees and many other insect populations that are struggling so much, and loads of ways in which we can involve children. I didn't mention them earlier, but there's so much that we can learn from them as well as be trying to teach them. And getting involved with perhaps helping them to design a bug hotel is a really simple thing that can capture the imagination. I just referred to it, but on St Lawrence's website, I found the following. So I hope this doesn't embarrass you, Mike, but Mike writes that God's original design for our world was a garden, the Garden of Eden. At the end of time, it will be restored, and since we're on God's team, we want to play our part in restoring it, which I think is just lovely. So just one of the many things that they are doing here at St Lawrence's is partnering with the Woodland Trust, who are here today, to plant trees. And they've literally planted thousands to date, including at Hungerford Primary School. Land and food growing in particular can also provide some great opportunities for partnerships with others, whether it be local wildlife trusts, schools, councils, or other churches. And a good place to start might be to understand what is on our land. We've just held a week-long initiative with Caring for God's Acre, the Church of England and the Church in Wales, called Churches Count on Nature, to encourage communities to get out and count nature, a bit like the RSPB Big Garden Birdwatch, with a view to understanding and protecting what we have. We've established a list of 25 targeted species and habitat, which collectively across our churches and landowners and so on, we want to see increase and come back to flourishing over the next few years. There are campaigns like No Mow May, which again has just happened. That's encouraging us to leave our lawns, whether a small patch or a whole lawn, unmown to help wildflowers and struggling pollinators. The impact of food growing and what we eat has huge implications for the climate. We could probably have a whole day's webinar on food. I'm not just going to touch on it. It is a massive and complex area, but of course at the heart of our lives. And growing food can be a simple act of service. So it is complex, but the principles of local, organic, animal-friendly, fairly traded are all good ones to follow. The whole premise of the church plant, Hazelnut Community Farm, just an hour or so to the west from here in Bristol, and Reverend John White's vision for it is that it would have at its core a church rooted in nature, a sacred space that engaged deeply with the climate emergency. And 3 years on, it's becoming a reality. It's actually a church without walls that meets outside in a garden space behind a soon-to-close Methodist church, and they're trying to secure the land. But there are vegetable and flower beds and a peace garden, and they care for this flourishing garden as part of being church, where they often plant what they are given and they give away what they grow, supporting other people and each other and the wider community, where many in the areas of Lockleys and Upper Hallfield are struggling with food insecurity. And their reach extends so far beyond their now 2 sites. They've got a vision for something called the Big Harvest, which they are really promoting for this autumn. They're promoting it across a growing network about encouraging people to connect to harvest by growing and giving food away as a spiritual exercise and a way to engage with food poverty. So imagine churches filled with harvest offerings for food banks of fresh, locally grown produce. I can just about remember when we used to go to my local church in Swansea years and years ago as a class to celebrate harvest. Somebody's mum was a beautiful baker and would bake this beautiful sheath of bread in the shape of a sheaf of wheat. But just imagine having offerings of fresh food that we've grown ourselves. Of course, the ideal would be that we don't need food banks at all. Community and global engagement is the 4th category of eco-church, and perhaps the one that's most about partnerships, though I've kind of touched on that already. We know that it's the poorest and the most vulnerable, as Mike emphasised, in our own communities as well as globally, who are ones that are already suffering the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, and often lack of access to green space. There's a huge amount that we can do, even starting with something simple and seemingly low-key as a litter pick. Again, litter was something that there seemed to be much less of during lockdown, but I think it says a lot about how we, our neighbourhood, feel about our local environment, and it can be a simple act of service that you can undertake with others. Our work at Wildflowers in Southall, a council-owned estate, started with a litter pick on an epic scale. Many tons of rubbish were removed to clear and create the site as it is today. It's got a sensory garden and a pond, an allotment space, and it's a community hub welcoming groups from many sectors of the society. We're holding an Act for Nature Day there next Saturday, when we'll provide training on wildflowers, pollination, and beekeeping. It's about an hour from here to the east, and you'd all be very welcome, but you do need to book on our events page. And there'll be another similar event at Hillfield Friary, one of our partners in action and Gold Awarded Eco Church. A church is in November. There are all sorts of ways in which we can partner with others in the community. To give you this lovely example that I've come across recently, because they literally our latest gold awarded church, St Paul's Church in Marylebone, over the past 8 years, so this is long-term work, has worked closely with Church Street Ward Neighbourhood Forum to focus on the built environment and how they can work to improve green spaces, housing, air quality, community facilities, and have a say in plans for the regeneration of that whole area. They're sort of in the enclosed bit of blue. Maybe doesn't work so well on the slide, but that's their patch. And through this partnership, which they've been in for a long time, St Paul's has hosted public meetings to discuss Westminster City Council plans for regeneration and to be able to listen to the community about their desires for and concerns about what they want and need, and environmental concerns, green spaces, play spaces, air quality, height of houses, use of land for community facilities. All of those were top of the agenda in the community's wishes for their area. So together they've compiled a neighbourhood plan which, when ratified, must be adhered to alongside the city plans for the regeneration. And as they begin to see this take effect, there are green spines through the centre of the community for people to be able to have access to green space, to enhance play, and provide spaces for the whole community to use. A lot of what I've said so far is relevant to us as individuals and as much in our churches and communities, but there's a specific section in EcoChurch on lifestyle which covers aspects such as how we travel, encouraging more walking and cycling, to the investment of church funds and personal savings, and how we use our money, whether we have a few pounds or many, can have a massive impact on the planet. There is a bank, the UK branch of which is not far from here. It's Triodos in Bristol, which invests in projects for people and the planet, such as sustainable farming and renewable energy. They have some fantastic stories on their website. And I know again that St Lawrence's has taken action in this area too, adopting an ethical investment policy, which includes divestment of fossil fuel company shares. I mentioned Wild Christian much earlier on. It's a significant and complementary scheme to EcoChurch for families and individuals, all about helping people to explore connections between our faith, our environment, and how we live. 5,000 must be the key number of the day, because there are now about 5,000 individuals who receive a monthly email with a biblical reflection and ideas for practical action to take and hear others' stories. But there's also an opportunity to campaign with others, a key action that I haven't yet mentioned. People sometimes ask if we can really make a difference through the actions that we might take as individuals and in our churches and communities. And yes, I genuinely believe we can, and it's part of trying to create the present hope that Margot was talking about. And especially when those actions are replicated thousands of times over. It's true, though, that we need political action from our own and other governments, as well as businesses and all sectors of society. Andy Atkins, our chief executive and a lifelong campaigner, puts it more strongly than this. I should have written up his quote. I haven't, so I will read it. He would do. It's time we revised the narrow definition of lifestyle. Our purchasing habits, dress, diet, and travel decisions are not the only means God gives us to act for his creation. Using our time and voice to campaign is also a behaviour, a choice about the shape and content of our daily lives, and the combination of the two is much more powerful than either on their own. Just a few weeks ago, we held a Wild Christian webinar on the Climate and Ecology Bill, formerly the CE Bill, of which Ecology UK are signatories, and it sets out a whole-of-government emergency plan to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels and reverse, not just halt, the destruction of nature in the UK by 2030. It also makes it clear that emissions from products that we import from countries such as China will treat as our own problem and not someone else's. You can find out more on the 0 Hour website, You can find a recording of that Wild Christian session and an interview with somebody from 0 Hour on the Ecology UK YouTube channel. So could you investigate this bill today? Or maybe not today, but while you're here, but in the next few days. And potentially sign up as an individual, as a church, in your community group. And write to your MP to support it too. Campaigning with others, marching with others, can be both a powerful testimony and a unifying moment. I took my 70-plus-year-old mother and my then 4-year-old son on a march a few years ago, led by Chris Packham. It was a walk for nature, a march for nature. And there's something very uniting and poignant about marching with others across the generations for the planet, as well as sending a signal to our politicians about what matters. Finally then, let me end with re-emphasising learning and acting together. And events like this one today can encourage us to do just that. None of us, no individual, no community organisation, no sector of society has all of the answers to the planetary challenges that we are facing. We have to approach this together. And we can accelerate our own change and have wider impact if we work very intentionally to learn from each other's successes and failures. So an important next step for each and every one of us, whatever our church or our role or however we're here today, is to find our own regular learning community, perhaps like Sage that was mentioned at the beginning, and to become very intentional about exchanging experiences of what works and how to get around blockages. It could be a deanery or diocesan forum, a local churches together group, joining with wildlife trusts locally, or the spaces that we provide in the Eco-Church programme, and some of the thematic webinars that we offer. And there's a lot of work going on at a diocesan level. Oxford Diocese has recently submitted its application for a Bronze Eco-Diocese Award, all about encouraging grassroots action from the diocese, as well as them taking action in areas of influence. So watch this space. Being part of an intentional learning community is not just good for spreading good practice fast, but vital for many of us psychologically to get some peer support and inspiration to keep going over the next years. And we need to look after ourselves and each other too. There are many ways in which you can join us at Ecology UK by registering for Eco-Church, signing up for Wild Christian, perhaps supporting us financially if you feel able, and joining us with us in prayer. We've got a prayer forum coming up on the 7th of July, and you'd be most welcome. I'm going to return to Christina Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnott from the book The Future We Choose. The world we must create. It's 2050. We've been successful at halving emissions every decade since 2020. In most places in the world, the air is moist and fresh, even in cities. This is the sort of restoration that we are called to be a part of. Thank you very much for listening.
Let you sit down, so.